California missions are among the state's most famous landmarks. The adobe buildings, little more than mud and straw, have survived political upheaval, earthquakes, and centuries of wear. But one researcher believes that even after hundreds of years, the missions have managed to keep one secret hidden, in plain sight.
A friar, he went in to unlock the doors and he opened them, both the lower section and the upper panels, and when he turned around, the sun was hitting the crucifix, this massive crucifix, and he was mesmerized.
Professor Ruben Mendoza of California State University, Monterey Bay, believes the California missions aren't crude religious outposts, but buildings which secretly incorporate a sophisticated astronomical design feature intended to capture the rays of the sun. If his theory is correct, the seemingly basic structures may hold the key to an entirely new understanding of the men who built them and the nature of their campaign to convert the native peoples of California. Mendoza, an archaeologist, has long been interested in missions from the Spanish colonial period. In 1997, he was doing research at the mission San Juan Bautista when he was made witness to an extraordinary phenomena.
Then in 1997, right about December 12th, Father Ed Fitzhenry had come out while I was in the digs to basically, notify me that that morning he had opened the church to a group of pilgrims who had gone there for the December 12th feast day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and they wanted the church unlocked early that morning. And he said that he'd seen something really amazing. When he opened the church that morning before 7, he said shortly thereafter a beam of light entered the church and struck the altar. And he said it was very intense.
However, while Mendoza was impressed by the event's beauty, he didn't believe it was necessarily man-made.
I continued to believe that what was happening at San Juan might be a unique or, it was a coincidence.
But that assumption was challenged when a nearly identical incident occurred in 2003 at a completely different mission, Carmel near Monterey.
On June 2nd, Ascension Sunday, the very friar, Father Emile Rabu, who had kind of poo-pooed the idea of what was going on at San Juan, had to unlock the church early in the morning. And there they have to open it at almost 6 in the morning.
The friar opened the church doors, both the main entranceway and the upper panels, and saw a similar effect to the one Mendoza had been alerted to at San Juan Bautista, sunlight illuminating a massive crucifix. The image made such an impression on the father that he incorporated it into his sermon about Ascension Sunday that morning. But Mendoza began to consider the phenomena, which he now calls illuminations, from his perspective as an archaeologist. He suspected the occurrences fit into a different pattern than did the priest.
That it wasn't Ascension Sunday because that cross couldn't have been there in the colonial period. It was installed, after the 1950s. And so I believed that it had to be winter solstice. So I geared up for that, went into the church with 2 video cameras, digital camera, still film cameras, and in 2003 I finally documented on the summer solstice. So now I had 2 sites, and I no longer saw it as a coincidence that you could have a summer solstice site and a winter solstice site in such a geographically constricted area.
Winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. Summer solstice is the longest. Both dates have significance in numerous cultures, but they are not important in the calendar of the Catholic Church. Nonetheless, Mendoza carried out observations at other missions, measuring the angles of the building's foundations relative to the shifting path of the sun in a solar year, and using cameras to record the movement of the rays of light that shone through the main windows of mission churches. He found that the 3 Archangel missions, San Rafael, which no longer exists but the original orientation of which is known, San Miguel and San Gabriel, were aligned such that their illuminations would occur on the same day. Mendoza says still other correlations indicate the effect was by design as well.
The mission at San Jose is illuminated on the feast day of St. Joseph during the vernal equinox, or near the vernal equinox, which is March 9th. And then on the other, in the mirror date, because it happens twice a year on the equinox sites, you have the illumination occurring on or about the feast day of St. Michael through the feast day of St. Francis. So I don't see that as a coincidence. And there's about 14 such sites now that we can link to this solar geometry in California.
John Warren is a curator at the mission San Miguel. Like Mendoza, he believes that not only the illumination of the figure of St. Michael at San Miguel is intentional, but also that the timing of the illuminations of adjacent figures in the church a few days before and after is also significant, due to the mission's prominent display of the 5 wounds of Christ.
the sun comes down here in the winter, fall. It comes down here and it strikes St. Francis, and it moves like this. And for 5 days, and then it's here, which is also very significant. And it actually takes another 5 days for it to hit here. And another 5 days, and it goes over here to St. Anthony, San Antonio.
While Warren is a supporter of Mendoza's theory, his interest in the phenomena is slightly different, and suggests one purpose such an effect might have: inspiring the faithful.
There was a service going on, and by golly, it was before the sun was up, and the sun was rising, and all of a sudden this illumination was on the wall, and it's moving down, and it's right on St. Francis, and everyone was totally amazed. The service had already started. They stopped the service, and they just sat there and looked at it. It's a very awe-inspiring thing to realize that the Padres building the mission, and now we know a number of missions, if not all of them, had such a perfect knowledge of the alignments, and took the time to build the building so it would align with some kind of an event with the sun. You have to witness it. If you witness one, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's pretty amazing.
But while spiritually significant to some, the idea that the illuminations are intentional also presents some members of the faithful with a troubling idea.
To think that a church that has, for the most part, been seen as this very formal institution that doesn't engage in these kinds of practices because they're seen as marginally pagan, was something that I was resisting, and others were resisting as well.
Mendoza's work has generated plenty of skepticism. Some early critics have become supporters of his theory, but others, like Andy Galvan, the curator of Mission Dolores in San Francisco and a descendant of Mission Indians, continue to say the illuminations cannot be intentional.
Knowing Father Serra as well as I know Father Serra, and I don't know if you know my connection with Father Serra, I've been working 30 years to have him made a saint, so I know him in and out. I don't believe Junipero Serra would have allowed what we would call some sort of a pagan lineup for the stars in the Catholic Church.
Galvan said some missions' illuminations didn't fit with Mendoza's theory, noting, for example, that Mission Dolores, the real name of which is Mission San Francisco de Asís, didn't experience its illumination on the feast day of St. Francis, even though Father Serra and the Padres of the California missions belonged to the Franciscan order. Galvan also pointed to another element of Mendoza's theory that he said didn't make sense.
And then the other premise is that Reuben says that the light shines on the tabernacle, okay? The tabernacle, the place where the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament, is reserved. However, in mission country, during the time of Junipero Serra, in the early years, in the entire time of Father Lasua and his successor, until the year 1808, the Blessed Sacrament was not allowed to be reserved in the mission churches. So in other words, what Reuben is saying, in mission churches that predate 1808, because that's the year Rome decided the Indians understood Eucharist and they could go to communion, he's saying that the Padres and the Indians lined up the tabernacle for solstice light shows, and that the light was shining on an empty box.
But despite skeptics' complaints about the complications Mendoza's theory gives rise to, Mendoza said he wasn't able to treat as coincidental the correlations he'd uncovered. Even the design of one of the missions appears to have been skewed to incorporate the effect, he said.
Even Rob Edwards, a good friend, questioned the fact that Mission San Juan, though you have a square quadrangle where the buildings are in, the final building was the church, and it's skewed almost 3 degrees off kilter with the rest of the quadrangle. And I raised that question, and I said, I now believe that was done to accommodate this illumination in such a large church. And he questioned that. He said, oh no, that could be accounted for as a result of changes in magnetic declination through time, because the North Pole, the magnetic north is constantly shifting. And then his next question was, well, surely this happened over the course of a couple of 100 years? And I said, no, the church was built within 5 to 8 years of the original quadrangle. And then he kind of stopped himself.
It wouldn't be the first time churches were used to capture the sun's rays. Long before the colonization of the New World, Catholic intellectuals were studying the sun to fix the broken calendar system used by the Holy Roman Empire, which underestimated the length of the solar year, skewing dates over time.
They began modifying churches, turning them into these giant camera obscura, in which you punch a small hole in a very big space, in a dark space, and you project the sun onto the floor. And they were studying sunspots, solar flares, and they were even projecting the diameter of the sun in relationship to the earth, and even the diameter of the earth at a time when we're told most people believed it was flat.
Mendoza said the Church's study of the sun offers a possible insight into why some California missions might time their illuminations during the solstices, despite both dates' lack of religious significance in Catholic tradition.
They had a section that dealt with how to calibrate the liturgical calendar using the solstice and equinox. So I know that, and those are books that were being used in the California missions, so I know the friars were using those as a matter of practice.
But Mendoza believes the use of the sun to illuminate California missions had another purpose, one that suggests the California missionaries were not as averse to the trappings of paganism as critics such as Galvan believe.
So I believe there's two things going on with these churches. One, they're continuing with the mandate to calibrate their liturgical year, and at the same time, they're accommodating indigenous belief. These structures clearly align with periods like the winter solstice, which were major celebrations in indigenous communities, in part because of the fear that the sun was dying. We also have the issue of the sunburst monstrance, who was devised in the New World. Even though it's a reliquary that holds the host, the body of Christ, in a crystal. We know these from Europe, but it isn't until these devices are brought into the New World, suddenly they have the sun emerging from them as a sunburst. It's clear that they were attempting to accommodate indigenous belief, but they weren't advertising that fact. And so I believe that the other dimension of these churches is that it is to kind of capture the solar worship or the sun worship that was already part of the indigenous tradition.
It's true the Catholic Church has incorporated many pagan symbols into its traditions over time, from Christmas trees to the Easter Bunny. But only time and further research will show whether Mendoza's theory and its controversial implications are true. But the attention generated by the phenomena and Mendoza's research offers mission advocates a much-needed opportunity to drum up interest in the state's landmarks. Mendoza said he hopes his work, which has attracted media interest and sparked academic debate, will convince people to pay attention to the troubled state of the historic structures. The aging buildings are bereft of state funding because of their affiliation with the Catholic Church, but they are in need of resources. Mission San Miguel was in danger of being torn down after a 2003 earthquake before advocates like Warren secured the necessary funding for a retrofit.
It's like a bridge to the past, and so people are beginning to appreciate the sophistication of these buildings that they've taken for granted all these years. And for me, I'm a member of the California Missions Foundation. We have been working diligently since the late 90s to try to protect these buildings, to preserve them, to conserve them, to restore them. And that's been like pulling teeth.